At the highest penthouse of a Manhattan hotel, where the windows touched the sky and champagne never ran dry, music floated through the air, shallow and empty, like forced laughter. It was the night of the Future Gala, an event where millionaires promised to save the world while flashing watches worth entire houses. In the middle of the glittering hall, a shove, a stumble, a laugh. "Watch it, boy," someone snapped. The boy, black, slender, clutched his white cane. Beside him, his mother stood in a simple dress, her eyes carrying only two things: faith and courage. The lights around them were blinding, but for him, darkness was always the same. Across the room, a tall, confident man, the most talked-about guest of the evening, watched with disdain. They said he bought companies the way others changed ties. That night, however, his arrogance would meet something money could never buy: the truth that flows from the soul. For when humiliation tries to silence a gift, God himself lifts the voice of justice. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. The ballroom was an ocean of crystal. Chandeliers poured down like waterfalls of light. Walls lined with modern art seemed to whisper their prices. Towering flower arrangements stood over tables, and at the center, a glossy black grand piano shone like a mirror. The air smelled of rare flowers and empty promises. Guests moved with rehearsed elegance. Women in gowns that floated like mist, men in tailored suits with smiles that never reached their eyes. Waiters glided like trained shadows, balancing trays of sparkling glasses. The hired jazz band played softly, the perfect soundtrack for conversations that barely masked rivalries. Near the bar, murmurs surrounded one man, Arthur Caldwell, tech billionaire and the night's biggest donor. Faces tilted in his direction, like plants turning toward the sun. Tall, white, with a chiseled jaw and eyes that measured people like numbers, Arthur was the evening's golden figure. Headlines worshipped him as the savior of innovation. Few dared to mention, at least not aloud, how his innovation had cost countless jobs and livelihoods. In this room, money's glow was brighter than truth. The master of ceremonies raised a glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Future Gala in support of arts in public schools." Applause, cameras, flashes. At the far left, beside a marble column, stood a woman with calloused hands who drew a deep breath. Her name was Ruth. Her navy blue dress was plain, but clean, neatly ironed. Her hair, tied into a hurried bun. In her eyes, the quiet courage of someone who had cried in silence yet learned to walk on. Beside her, leaning on a white cane, stood Eli, her 12-year-old son. His black skin was like midnight, yet he carried a light that didn't come from the chandeliers. It came from within. The invitation that had brought them here felt like a miracle. Eli's public school in Harlem had chosen students to represent their community at the event. It was meant to be a night of opportunity. Ruth had thanked God. Maybe here someone would hear her son's gift. Maybe tonight a door would open that life had always tried to close. A kind waiter approached. "May I help you with anything?" "We just need a little space," Ruth said, glancing at the piano in the distance. "He dreams of playing." The waiter gave a respectful smile. "Then may you dream big tonight." Ruth squeezed Eli's hand. "The piano is near, my son." "I can hear it," Eli replied softly, smiling. "The strings are slightly off in the middle register." Ruth's eyes welled with pride. "Only you would notice that, my love." At the center, Arthur Caldwell toasted with investors, his voice booming like he owned the air. "It's simple. Real talent is found in the finest schools. The rest is just romantic nonsense." Laughter erupted around him. Nods followed like trained echoes. A consultant whispered, "Mr. Caldwell, rumor has it there'll be a surprise performance from public school students." Arthur raised a brow, feigning interest. "A surprise? Let's just hope it's brief." Time ticked by. Silent auctions, speeches, promises. Every table bore a golden plaque with names and minimum donation amounts that could choke any working family. Yet the word future floated in the air, as if it were a luxury commodity. Near the piano, A technician fine-tuned a stubborn key. Eli tilted his head, listening closely. "Mom," he whispered. "This piano has cried before." Ruth clasped his hand. "Tonight it will cry again, but this time, with joy." On stage, a well-known philanthropist took the microphone. "Tonight we celebrate opportunity. May the arts reach those who need them most." Lukewarm applause, more clinking glasses. That's when Arthur Caldwell noticed Ruth and Eli. His gaze scanned her plain dress, dropped to the white cane, then froze on the boy's unseeing eyes. A cold smirk spread across his face. Two socialites leaned close, whispering, stifling giggles. That's how injustice begins. With small permissions, mocking glances, whispers sharp enough to wound. The ballroom seemed perfect. But perfection, sometimes, is only the curtain hiding the test. And the test that night was just beginning. The marble doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open, but unlike the grand entrances of wealthy couples who glided in wrapped in diamonds, this arrival was different. Quiet, hesitant, almost invisible to most, but not to everyone. Ruth guided Eli by the hand, each step careful, deliberate. Her heels were not designer, just a modest pair polished with love. Eli, dressed in a borrowed suit 2 sizes too big, carried himself with dignity far greater than his years. The white cane tapped softly against the marble floor. Tap, pause, tap. A rhythm that seemed to clash with the room's artificial symphony of laughter and clinking glasses. A woman in a glittering silver gown noticed them and tilted her head. "Who let them in?" she muttered under her breath, her voice dripping with irritation. Her companion shrugged. "Probably some charity case. Tonight's theme is arts for the poor, after all. It makes for good photographs." The words reached Ruth's ears like a sting, but she kept her head high, whispering quietly to her son. "Don't mind the whispers, Eli. We belong here as much as anyone else." "Yes, Mama," Eli answered, his voice calm, steady. "God brought us here." They walked deeper into the glittering sea of wealth. Heads turned, eyes scanned them with curiosity, not admiration, but the kind that strips away dignity. A man in a tuxedo whispered, "Blind and black. What kind of performance are they expecting from this one?" His partner chuckled softly, sipping champagne. "It'll be pitiful at best, but perhaps pitiful earns applause these days." Ruth felt her chest tighten, but she held on to faith. She pressed Eli's hand, guiding him toward the piano at the far end of the room. Meanwhile, Arthur Caldwell noticed their presence more clearly now. He squinted, watching them cross the floor, his lips curling into a smirk of amusement. He leaned toward his circle of investors. "Take a look. The evening just got interesting," he murmured with cruel sarcasm. The men around him chuckled, eager to mirror his reaction. At that very moment, Eli tilted his head upward, as though sensing the stares aimed at him. He could not see, but he could feel. The air itself carried arrogance, pride, disbelief, and all of it pressed against his small frame like invisible chains. Yet his shoulders straightened, his chin lifted. "Where's the piano, Mama?" he asked softly. "Straight ahead," Ruth whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "You'll be near it soon." As they passed through the crowd, a photographer lowered his camera, clearly uninterested. After all, why capture plainness when surrounded by diamonds? But another photographer, older, with gentler eyes, lifted his lens. He snapped a photo quietly. The boy, the mother, and the cane. Something about the image told him this moment mattered. He didn't know why, but he trusted the instinct. The music from the band stopped briefly. The room shifted, and for a fraction of a second, the sound of Eli's cane tapping across the marble echoed louder than everything else. People turned their heads. Eyes narrowed. Conversations paused. The boy's presence was undeniable now. Ruth whispered again, this time not to Eli but to God. "Lord, give me strength. Let my son not be shamed tonight. Let them see what you placed in him." The white cane touched the bass of the grand piano. Eli smiled faintly, his fingers brushing its polished edge. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "I can feel it breathing." But before Ruth could answer, a shadow fell over them. The shadow of wealth, arrogance, and cruelty. Arthur Caldwell himself was making his way across the ballroom, each step echoing authority. His smirk hadn't faded. The crowd, sensing drama, hushed slightly. And so the stage was set. The humble had arrived and the proud had noticed. The night of testing was about to begin. Arthur Caldwell moved through the ballroom like a king inspecting his court. His tailored tuxedo shimmered subtly under the crystal chandeliers. His shoes clicked sharply against the marble, a sound that silenced whispers in his path. People stepped aside instinctively, as though his wealth granted him more space than the rest. Ruth felt her breath catch as she saw him approach. Eli, sensing the tension in the room, tilted his head. "Who's coming, Mama?" he asked quietly. Ruth hesitated. She wanted to shield him, but the truth was impossible to hide. "The man everyone seems to admire," she answered softly. "Arthur Caldwell." Arthur stopped just a few feet away, his gaze dropping to Eli. He studied him from head to toe, the too big suit, the cane, the blindness. Then he let out a low chuckle, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Well, well," Arthur began, his voice rich with mockery. "And what do we have here? The entertainment portion of the evening?" Laughter rippled from a few guests standing behind him. Others pressed their lips together, uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere. In a place where money ruled, morality often stayed silent. Ruth drew herself up, her voice trembling but firm. "My son is here because he was invited. He has a gift." Arthur cut her off with a raised hand. "A gift? Really? Let me guess. He's some prodigy we're supposed to clap for because it's heartwarming?" Eli's face flushed, but he stood tall, gripping the edge of the piano. His voice, soft but steady, rose above the murmurs. "I don't need your pity." Arthur's smirk widened, amused by the boy's courage. "Pity? Oh no, son. I'm just fascinated. See, this is exactly what I talk about. They bring in charity cases to make us feel like we're making a difference. Meanwhile, the real talent comes from people who can afford the best." The words sliced through the room like knives. Ruth's eyes welled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She whispered a prayer under her breath. "Lord, do not let my son's spirit break." Arthur turned toward the crowd, raising his glass as though delivering a toast. "Ladies and gentlemen, behold, the symbol of tonight's event. The poor, blind child who will remind us all how fortunate we are." Some gasped softly at his cruelty. Others laughed nervously, desperate to align with his arrogance. Cameras clicked again, but this time not all of them were friendly. One journalist frowned deeply, lifting his camera to capture Arthur's sneer. Eli clenched his fists. He felt every ounce of humiliation, every cruel chuckle aimed at him. Yet deep inside, another fire began to rise. Not anger, but something stronger. He whispered, just loud enough for his mother to hear. "Mama, if they let me touch the keys, I'll show them what God gave me." Ruth squeezed his hand, her heart pounding with fear and hope all at once. "They'll see, my son. They'll see." Arthur tilted his head, amused. He leaned down slightly toward Eli and whispered, though loud enough for others nearby to catch, "Tell me, boy, do you even know which way the piano faces?" More laughter. Ruth gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Eli, however, turned his head toward Arthur's voice and answered calmly, "No, but I don't need to see the keys to make them sing." The ballroom hushed. The boy's words, so simple, carried a weight that unsettled even those who had laughed moments before. Arthur straightened, clearly irritated by the child's composure. "Then by all means," he sneered. "Prove it." And with that, he gestured grandly toward the piano. The trap had been set. What Arthur meant as humiliation would soon become his greatest undoing. At first, the silence in the ballroom was heavy, charged, like the moment before a storm. Then, laughter. Not the joyful kind that warms hearts, but sharp, cutting laughter that spread across the room like fire on dry grass. A group of young heirs near the champagne fountain doubled over, clutching their glasses. "Did you hear that?" one scoffed. "The blind boy wants to make the piano sing." Another added, "What's next? Maybe he'll paint us a picture too." Their laughter cracked through the air, raw with cruelty. Others tried to hide their amusement behind polite smiles. A woman fanned herself and whispered to her husband, "Why do they let people like this into events like ours? It ruins the atmosphere." Her husband nodded, chuckling under his breath. Ruth felt each word pierce her chest like a blade. She stood frozen, clutching Eli's shoulder as though she could shield him from the venom spilling into the room. She wanted to cry, but instead she prayed silently. "Lord, turn their laughter into shame. Protect my boy's spirit." Eli stood quietly, his small hand resting on the smooth surface of the piano. His face betrayed no tears. Instead, he tilted his head, listening. Not to the laughter, not to the ridicule, but to something else. Deep within him a melody was stirring, rising above the noise of the room. Arthur Caldwell raised his hand dramatically, pretending to restore order, though he himself was grinning. Now, he said mockingly, "let's not be too harsh. After all, he did come dressed for the occasion." His eyes darted to Eli's oversized suit, drawing another wave of cruel chuckles from the crowd. But not everyone was laughing. Near the back, an elderly woman in a modest pearl necklace shook her head, whispering to the friend beside her, "This is shameful. That child deserves respect." Her friend nodded, but lowered her voice quickly. "Careful. If Arthur hears you, you'll be on his bad side." So they stayed quiet like so many others, their disapproval buried under fear of power. A reporter scribbled furiously into his notebook. His camera hung at his side, but his mind was already framing the headline, "Billionaire mocks blind child at gala." Meanwhile, Ruth leaned closer to Eli, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Son, you don't have to do this. We can leave. We don't need their approval." But Eli shook his head slowly. His voice was calm, almost serene. "Mama, they're not laughing at me. They're laughing at what they don't understand. God gave me music, and tonight he'll let them hear it." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of awe. How could a boy so young carry such strength? Arthur, growing impatient, tapped his glass with a silver spoon, demanding silence. The crystal sound rang out, pulling the crowd back to him like gravity. "Enough chatter," he announced smugly. "Let us give our guest a chance. After all, miracles happen every day, or so I'm told." The laughter simmered down, though smirks remained on many faces. All eyes turned toward Eli. The grand piano gleamed under the lights, waiting. The boy placed his hand gently on the keys, not yet pressing, just feeling the instrument's breath beneath his fingertips. The crowd leaned forward, some with anticipation, most with mockery, and a few with the faintest glimmer of hope. The laughter had filled the room, but soon it would be replaced by something else entirely. Arthur Caldwell stood with his glass raised, savoring the hush that had fallen over the crowd. His smirk deepened, the kind of smile a predator wears when the prey has nowhere left to run. "Well then," he said slowly, drawing out each word as though it were part of a performance. "Since our young guest insists that he can play, why don't we give him the honor of entertaining us tonight?" The word honor dripped with poison. A few people chuckled nervously. Others clapped lightly, though not out of support, only to please Arthur. The sound echoed awkwardly in the ballroom, sharp and hollow. Ruth's heart pounded. She clutched Eli's shoulder, whispering urgently, "You don't owe them anything, my son. Don't let them use you as their amusement." But Eli placed his hand gently over hers. His touch was calm, steady. "Mama, this isn't for them. It's for God. And for you." Arthur leaned down slightly, speaking in a tone that was meant to humiliate. "Go on, boy. Show us how you play. Surely a blind child with a gift will amaze us all." His circle of investors burst into laughter. Eli turned his head toward Arthur's voice, his face calm, almost peaceful. "You ask me to play as a joke," he said softly. "But music isn't a joke. Music is truth, and the truth doesn't need eyes to see." The words silenced some of the smirks. Even Arthur blinked, caught off guard for a brief second, but pride doesn't back down easily. He straightened, sneering again. "Big words for such a small boy. Let's see if your fingers can match your tongue." The room buzzed with whispers. Some were cruel. "He's going to embarrass himself. This will be painful to watch." Others carried a flicker of doubt. What if he really can play? Did you hear the way he spoke? The tension in the air was palpable. The grand piano sat under the glow of the chandeliers, waiting like a stage prepared by destiny itself. Arthur stepped back and spread his arms wide, addressing the crowd as if he were the master of ceremonies. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's program has changed. Forget the scheduled performers. Our main act will be Eli, the blind prodigy." The way he said prodigy oozed sarcasm, earning another round of uneasy laughter. Ruth felt her legs weaken. She wanted to scream, to grab her son and run. But Eli, with a quiet strength that seemed far too great for his small frame, guided himself toward the piano bench. His cane tapped softly against the floor until he reached the seat. He placed the cane carefully beside him, then sat, running his small hands over the polished surface. The ballroom was utterly still now. Some leaned forward, eager to witness humiliation. Others crossed their arms, ready to dismiss him. But a handful of faces softened, their eyes filled with unexpected curiosity. Arthur raised his glass one last time, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Play, boy. Make us laugh, or make us cry. Either way, you'll give us a story to tell." Eli placed his fingers gently on the keys. For a moment, he didn't press them. He simply listened. He tilted his head, as if hearing a sound no one else could. Ruth closed her eyes, whispering, "Lord, let them hear what I have heard in the quiet nights at home. Let them feel what I have felt when my son plays for you." The silence stretched. Every breath in the ballroom seemed to pause. The cruel invitation had been made. The trap had been set. But in the next moment, the piano itself would bear witness to where true greatness comes from. The boy's small hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. Around him, the ballroom grew eerily quiet. The laughter that had filled the air minutes earlier dissolved into whispers, then into silence. The only sound now was the faint clinking of ice in a forgotten glass, the distant hum of the city far below. Ruth stood behind her son, her fingers interlocked so tightly they had turned white. She whispered without realizing anyone could hear, "Please, Lord, be his strength." Arthur Caldwell, standing only a few feet away, leaned lazily on a column, swirling his champagne. His smirk had not disappeared, but his eyes narrowed with a flicker of curiosity. He wanted this to be a disaster, a spectacle, but a small, unwelcome thought crept into his mind. What if the boy actually plays? The guests leaned in, their breaths shallow, waiting. Some had already raised their phones discreetly, ready to capture either humiliation or miracle. Eli inhaled slowly, letting the air fill his chest. He could hear everything, the shallow gasps, the muffled chuckles, the beating of his mother's heart behind him. But louder than all of it was something else, the music already playing inside his soul. His lips moved in a whisper only Ruth could hear. "The piano is like a voice, Mama, and voices don't lie." He pressed a single key. Just one. A soft note, fragile yet clear, drifted through the hall. It wasn't music yet. It was a question. The crowd shifted, confused. Some laughed under their breath. "That's it?" a man muttered. Arthur raised an eyebrow, mocking. "Perhaps he's warming up. Let's hope he knows more than one note." But Eli ignored them. He pressed another key, then another, as if testing the soul of the instrument. The sound filled the air, rich and resonant. His fingers moved gently, searching, discovering. The silence stretched longer, heavier. Guests who had been smirking now found themselves strangely uneasy. Something about the boy's stillness, his patience, unsettled them. Eli sat motionless, his eyes closed, though sightless, his hands resting softly on the keys. The room seemed to hold its breath with him. Even the waiters froze in place, trays balanced mid-air. Ruth whispered again, her voice breaking with emotion. They don't know. They don't know what's about to happen. And in truth, no one did. Because in that vast silence, a silence thick enough to make even the proudest billionaire shift uncomfortably, a miracle was preparing to unfold. The storm before the song had begun. Eli's fingers pressed down gently, and the first chord bloomed through the ballroom like a breath of fresh air after a storm. The sound was pure, unshaken, carrying a warmth that silenced even the faintest whispers. It wasn't just music. It was a voice. The crowd froze. Every eye, every camera, every breath turned to the boy at the piano. At first, Arthur Caldwell smirked again, whispering to the man beside him, "Not bad for a warm-up trick." But his voice faltered when the next sequence of notes cascaded like falling water, delicate, precise, yet overflowing with power. Eli played with no hesitation now. His small hands, which moments earlier had seemed fragile, moved with speed and confidence across the keys. Each note rose and fell as though guided by something beyond technique, something divine. The music swelled, filling every corner of the glittering hall. It was not a rehearsed piece. It was something deeper, something born in that very moment. A melody woven from struggle, from faith, from nights when Ruth had wiped tears in the dark while her son played to comfort her. A woman in the front row gasped, her hand covering her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. This isn't a child playing," she whispered. This is a soul speaking." The rhythm shifted, stronger now, echoing with pain and resilience. It carried the weight of every cruel laugh, every door that had been slammed in their faces, every whisper that told Ruth her son would never fit in. Yet it also carried hope, a soaring light that seemed to lift the very walls of the ballroom. Even the waiters, who had trained themselves to remain invisible, stopped in their tracks. Trays trembled in their hands as they turned toward the piano, eyes wide, hearts pounding to the rhythm of the melody. And then, the tears began. First, a young socialite who had laughed moments earlier pressed a napkin to her face, her mascara running. Then, a middle-aged man, a businessman known for his ruthlessness, wiped his eyes in disbelief. Soon, pockets of the crowd sniffled, dabbed at tears, held hands to their chests. The music broke them open. Arthur Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. His smirk had vanished. His jaw tightened as the melody climbed higher, brighter, wrapping itself around every listener like a force they could not resist. He looked around and saw his guests, his people, crying, trembling, moved to their very core, and he hated it. But even Arthur, with all his pride, felt something crack inside him. He clenched his glass tighter, his knuckles white, as though resisting the pull of the music itself. Eli leaned into the final passage, his body swaying with the rhythm, his head tilted back as though he were no longer in that ballroom, but somewhere higher, somewhere beyond sight. His hands flew across the keys, faster, stronger, until the melody surged like a wave and crashed into a breathtaking silence. For one long moment, no one moved. Then, a single clap. Slow, hesitant. But soon, another joined. And another. Until the entire ballroom erupted in applause, the kind that shook the chandeliers above their heads. People were on their feet. Some were weeping openly. Others clasped their hands as though in prayer. Cameras flashed not out of mockery now, but to capture a miracle they knew they would never forget. Ruth pressed her hand to her mouth, sobbing, her knees weak. She whispered through her tears, "Thank you, God. Thank you." Eli sat silently at the piano, his hands resting gently on the keys. He didn't smile, didn't boast. He simply breathed, his face calm, as though he had given everything to the music and had nothing left but peace. The laughter that had once filled the room was gone. In its place, awe, reverence, tears. The melody had touched every soul in that ballroom, and not one of them would ever be the same. The thunder of applause roared through the ballroom. Guests were on their feet, clapping, cheering, some openly weeping. The same people who had smirked and whispered cruel jokes minutes earlier now looked as though they had witnessed a miracle. But not everyone was celebrating. Arthur Caldwell stood frozen, his glass still in his hand, though untouched. His jaw tightened as he scanned the room. Everywhere he looked, faces were radiant with awe, moved by the music of a boy he had mocked. His kingdom of influence, the nods, the approval, the eager laughter that always followed him, had shifted. And it wasn't toward him. It was toward the blind black boy at the piano. Arthur's chest tightened, a feeling unfamiliar to him. Shame. He tried to smirk, but his lips twitched. He forced a chuckle, attempting to regain his dominance. "Well," he said loudly, trying to drown out the applause. That was surprisingly adequate. But his words fell flat. No one laughed. No one agreed. Instead, a woman near the front turned to him with narrowed eyes. "Adequate?" she said sharply. "That child just played better than any musician I've ever heard." Others nodded in agreement. Someone added, "He moved the entire room to tears. That wasn't adequate. That was extraordinary." Arthur's smirk cracked. He looked around for support, but the investors who had once echoed his every word avoided his gaze. One fiddled nervously with his cufflinks, another pretended to check his phone. Even his closest allies dared not side with him now. The sound of the applause only grew stronger, filling the ballroom like a wave that drowned his pride. Guests pressed forward toward the piano, eager to shake Ruth's hand, to praise Eli, to take photos beside them. Ruth clutched her son's shoulders, tears streaming down her face. Her voice trembled with gratitude. "Eli, do you hear them? Do you hear what they're saying?" Eli tilted his head, smiling faintly. "I don't need to hear the words, Mama. I hear their hearts." Arthur clenched his fists. His empire had been built on control, on commanding the admiration of rooms just like this one. Yet now, in his own arena, he had been dethroned by a child. One of the reporters who had been silently observing finally stepped forward, his pen in hand. He looked directly at Arthur as he spoke, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Mr. Caldwell, how does it feel to mock a boy, only to watch him move an entire room to tears with his gift?" The question hit him like a slap. Cameras turned his way. Flashes burst, not on Eli this time, but on him. Arthur stammered, caught off guard. I was simply encouraging him," he said weakly, "testing his potential." The guests murmured disapproval. The same crowd that once hung on his every word now shook their heads. His mask of arrogance was slipping, and everyone could see it. Arthur Caldwell, the man who thought himself untouchable, was standing in the ruins of his own pride. And the boy he had tried to humiliate sat at the piano, serene, victorious, without even realizing the power he had unleashed. The applause lingered like thunder rolling across the mountains, refusing to die. Eli sat quietly at the piano, his small hands resting in his lap. He did not bow, he did not boast. His silence was more powerful than any speech. Then, from the back of the room, a man stepped forward. Not just any man, but Henry Whitmore, a world-renowned music juror, composer, and head of one of the most prestigious conservatories in the country. His white hair and sharp eyes made him instantly recognizable to many in the crowd. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. "That's Whitmore," someone whispered. "The man who decides careers. What's he doing here?" Arthur's head snapped toward him, startled. He hadn't expected the night to take this turn. Henry walked steadily through the parted crowd, his eyes fixed on Eli. When he reached the piano, he stopped, letting the silence settle before he spoke. His voice was calm, but carried the authority of decades in the world of music. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what you have just witnessed him is not luck. It is not charity. It is not a trick." He turned to Eli, his expression softening. "This boy is a genius." The words struck the crowd like lightning. Murmurs rose instantly, blending with astonished gasps. Arthur laughed nervously, trying to regain ground. "Genius? Come now. Surely you're exaggerating. He's just, well, he surprised us, that's all." But Henry's eyes cut to Arthur, sharp as a blade. "I do not exaggerate," he said firmly. "I have judged competitions across the world. I have heard prodigies, virtuosos, professionals at the highest level. And yet tonight, this child has played with a depth I have only heard a handful of times in my life." He stepped closer to Eli, lowering his voice so it carried sincerity, not spectacle. "Son, what is your name?" Eli turned his head toward the voice. His lips curved into a modest smile. "My name is Eli." Henry nodded, his eyes glistening. "Eli, do you know that your name means ascended? Tonight you have lifted this entire room higher than it was before you touched these keys." Tears streamed down Ruth's face. She whispered, barely able to speak, "Thank you, Lord, they see him now." Henry turned back to the crowd. "This boy is more than a prodigy. He has a gift that must be nurtured. I will personally see to it that he is given a full scholarship at my conservatory. The world needs to hear him." The room erupted again, not with laughter, not with whispers, but with applause and cheers. People shouted words of praise. "Amazing! God bless him. This is history." Arthur's face drained of color. He tried to interject, forcing a strained smile. "Well, of course, I was simply giving him a chance to shine. Yes, I knew he had potential all along. But no one listened. No one cared." His words were swallowed by the tide of admiration flowing toward Eli and Ruth. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing relentlessly. One leaned toward Ruth. "Ma'am, how does it feel to see your son recognized like this?" Ruth, trembling, held Eli close to her side. Her voice cracked with emotion as she answered, "It feels like justice. It feels like God's promise." The crowd erupted in cheers once more. Henry placed a hand gently on Eli's shoulder. "Your journey has just begun, young man. Tonight was not an end. It was a beginning." Arthur stood alone, drowning in silence, his power stripped away by the undeniable truth. He had mocked a child, and that child had risen higher than all his wealth could ever reach. The ballroom, moments ago a theater of mockery, had transformed into a sanctuary of awe. Every guest stood, clapping, cheering, many with tears streaming down their faces. It was no longer about wealth, appearances, or status. It was about truth, revealed through the hands of a boy who couldn't even see the faces of those he had moved. Ruth clung to Eli, sobbing freely now. Her tears were not of pain but of overwhelming gratitude. She whispered into his ear between sobs, "My son, they see you now. They finally see what God has always shown me." Eli tilted his head toward her, smiling softly. "Mama, I didn't play for them. I played for him. But if they heard it too, then maybe that was his plan." Those words rippled through Ruth's heart like a hymn. She pressed her forehead to his, whispering, "Never doubt that, Eli. God raised you up tonight." Henry Whitmore remained at Eli's side, his voice loud enough to silence the applause for a moment. "This boy will go far. Not because of charity, but because of his talent. Pure, undeniable talent. Tonight, you witnessed history." The crowd erupted again, louder than before. A group of donors approached Ruth eagerly, offering support, scholarships, even funding for Eli's journey. Ruth could barely respond, overwhelmed by the flood of kindness that had replaced cruelty. Meanwhile, at the far side of the room, Arthur Caldwell stood alone. His once commanding presence had shriveled into something pitiful. His glass trembled in his hand. Every time he tried to speak, he was drowned out by applause for Eli. His allies, the investors and sycophants who once clung to him, avoided his eyes now, ashamed of having laughed at his cruelty. One reporter, seizing the moment, turned a camera directly on Arthur. "Mr. Caldwell, do you have any words for the boy you mocked tonight?" Arthur's lips parted, but no sound came. He looked at Eli, small, blind, humble, surrounded by adoration and light. And for the first time in his life, Arthur Caldwell realized that his billions, his power, his arrogance had bought him nothing in this moment. Nothing at all. He turned away, his pride shattered. Back at the piano, Eli lifted his small hands once more. "May I play again, Mama?" he asked. Ruth wiped her tears, nodding quickly. "Yes, my son, play." And so he did. The melody that followed was softer this time, a gentle hymn, almost like a prayer. The room stilled, many bowing their heads as if in reverence. It was not a performance now. It was worship. By the time Eli finished, silence filled the room. Not empty silence, but the kind that carries weight, as though everyone had been touched by something sacred. Then slowly the applause returned, rising like a wave, louder and louder until the hall shook with the sound of hearts uniting. Ruth looked upward, whispering with trembling lips, "Justice belongs to the Lord, and tonight he has shown it." Eli stood, guided by his mother's hand, and the crowd parted to let them through. Guests reached out, blessing them, thanking them, even begging for photographs. But Ruth kept walking, her son beside her, their steps steady and proud. For the first time in years she felt light, as though the chains of poverty, humiliation, and scorn had been broken in a single night. At the doors of the ballroom, Eli paused. He turned back, his unseeing eyes lifted toward the crowd. "Thank you for listening," he said softly. And with that he left, leaving behind not just an audience, but witnesses to a truth they would never forget. That God does not abandon the humble, that arrogance falls, and that sometimes justice arrives in the form of a song. Have you ever seen the humble triumph over the powerful? Tell us your story in the comments. Do you believe that God always lifts those who are mocked? Write your faith below. Never lose hope. Justice may take time, but it always comes, and in the end, good always wins.